The dark, full-bodied red wine dripped slowly from my chin. I could feel the cold liquid seeping through the fibers of my pale cashmere sweater, a sweater I had bought for myself just 2 days ago to celebrate a successful quarter at work. Now it was ruined, stained with the physical manifestation of my mother's uncontrollable rage. The living room of my home, a sprawling 5-bedroom sanctuary that my late husband and I had poured our blood, sweat, and tears into building, was entirely silent. The kind of silence that rings in your ears. The kind of silence that follows a car crash. 50 guests stood frozen in place. These were people I had known my entire life. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends, and neighbors. They all stood there with crystal glasses in their hands, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly parted in collective shock. The soft, elegant jazz music playing from the ceiling speakers seemed to mock the heavy, suffocating tension that had just fallen over the room like a thick blanket. The smell of expensive catered food, roasted prime rib and garlic butter shrimp, suddenly made my stomach churn. Just a few seconds ago, my father, Gideon, had stood by the grand stone fireplace. He was holding a glass of vintage champagne, smiling like a benevolent king addressing his loyal subjects. He tapped his glass with a silver spoon to get everyone's attention. He cleared his throat and announced to the entire room that I, his generous and loving daughter, was officially gifting my house to my younger sister, Sloane, and her new husband. He painted a beautiful picture for the crowd. He told them how I was ready to downsize, how I wanted to support my little sister as she prepared to start a family, and how this transfer of property was a testament to our unbreakable family bond. The crowd had actually started to clap. They smiled at me, waiting for me to step forward and accept my role as the selfless, sacrificing widow. But I did not smile. I did not step forward to embrace my sister. I stared my father dead in the eye, raised my chin, and said a very simple, very firm no. The clapping stopped instantly. The illusion my father had so carefully constructed shattered into a million jagged pieces right there on my hardwood floor. My mother, Greta, had been standing next to me. When the word left my mouth, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered fury. It was a face I had seen many times behind closed doors when I failed to meet her impossible expectations, but she had never dared to wear it in public. Until tonight. She did not hesitate. She did not argue. She simply pulled her arm back and hurled the entire contents of her wine glass directly into my face. The liquid splashed violently across my cheeks, blinding my left eye for a terrifying second. It dripped down my nose, my chin, my neck. Then came the words, spat out with so much venom they seemed to vibrate in the silent room. You are a selfish, bitter widow hoarding a life you do not deserve. Your sister needs this more than you ever will. You are dead to me. Those words were meant to break me. They were designed to humiliate me into submission. My mother knew I hated making a scene. She calculated that if she publicly shamed me, if she treated me like a disobedient dog in front of our entire extended family, I would crumble. I would cry, apologize, and hand over the keys just to make the awful stares stop. My father stood silently by the fireplace, watching me with a cold, calculated stare, waiting for my surrender. Sloane, standing a few feet away in a designer cocktail dress, was actually smirking behind her champagne flute. She thought she had won. But I was not the same woman they had bullied for 42 years. I did not wipe my face. I did not scream back at my mother. I did not try to explain myself to the crowd of relatives who were already whispering, judging, and taking sides. The rage inside me was cold and precise. I simply turned on my heel. The heels of my shoes clicked sharply, rhythmically against the hardwood floor. I walked straight toward the sliding glass doors leading to the back patio. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, no one daring to speak or make eye contact. I slid the heavy glass door open and stepped outside into the crisp, cool autumn night. The air hit my wet skin, making me shiver, but my hands were perfectly steady. I reached into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the darkness of the patio. I opened my messages and found the chat with my best friend, Blair. She was currently hiding in the guest bathroom upstairs, waiting for my signal. I typed 2 words. Start now. I pressed send. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, crossed my arms, and took a deep breath of the night air. I looked out at the garden, at the beautiful rose bushes my husband had planted during our first spring in this house. 10 seconds passed. The house behind me remained eerily quiet. 20 seconds. I could hear the faint sound of traffic in the distance. 30 seconds. 45 seconds. Then it happened. A terrifying, ear-piercing scream echoed from the second floor of the house. It was Sloane. Her voice was shrill, filled with genuine horror. A moment later, a massive, deafening crash shook the ceiling of the living room, followed by a chorus of panicked shouts from the guests inside. Someone yelled my father's name. Another heavy thud echoed through the walls. The elegant anniversary party was officially over. The chaos had finally begun. But nobody inside that house understood what was really falling from the sky. To them, this was a sudden outburst, a family tragedy unfolding in real time. They had no idea that this moment was the culmination of 8 months of silent agony, emotional manipulation, and the slow, deliberate theft of my sanctuary. They did not know the truth about my parents, or the truth about the golden child they worshipped. How did my own flesh and blood end up trying to steal my home in front of 50 people? To understand that, you have to look past the beautiful facade of my family. You have to understand the invisible life I lived for decades and the promises I made to a dying man. What happens when the scapegoat finally stops running and turns around to face the wolves? I was born into the role of the invisible child. In a family that worshipped outward appearances and social status, I was the one who never quite fit their carefully curated aesthetic. My parents, Gideon and Greta, viewed life as a grand stage play where they were the elite, tragic, misunderstood protagonists. They wore designer clothes they bought on high-interest credit cards, leased luxury cars they could barely afford to put gas in, and spoke with an air of superiority that convinced most people they came from generational wealth. They were masters of the illusion. Then there was Sloane. My younger sister was their ultimate masterpiece. 7 years younger than me, she was born with my mother's delicate, conventionally attractive features and my father's arrogant, manipulative charm. From the moment she could walk, she was the undisputed golden child. The rules did not apply to Sloane. If she got a failing grade in high school, my mother would storm into the principal's office and scream that the teachers were incompetent and jealous of her daughter's brilliance. If I got a perfect score on a math test, my father would barely look up from his newspaper, muttering that I should focus on my posture instead of staring at books all day. Sloane grew up to become a self-proclaimed lifestyle consultant. That is a very fancy, modern title for someone who spends her days scrolling through social media, drinking $20 artisanal lattes, and spending money she does not have. My parents fully funded her delusion. They praised her creativity and entrepreneurial spirit, despite the glaring fact that she had never earned a single legitimate paycheck in her entire life. They bought her clothes, paid her rent, and paraded her around as the success of the family. I took a radically different path. I never asked them for a dime. I worked my way through a state college and eventually built a mid-sized HVAC parts distribution company in Central Ohio. My business was blue-collar. It was gritty, loud, and dealt with massive steel pipes, Freon tanks, industrial fans, and warehouse logistics. I spent my days wearing steel-toed boots and talking to contractors. My parents despised my career. They were deeply embarrassed by it. When their country club friends asked what I did for a living, my mother would quickly interject and say I was in corporate management because admitting her daughter sold air conditioning parts was too vulgar for their refined tastes. But here was the irony they loved to ignore. My gritty, vulgar business was highly profitable. I was making more money in a month than they made in a year. I met my husband, Beckett, when we were both 25. He was an independent contractor, a man with calloused, strong hands, a loud laugh, and a heart of pure gold. We were two of a kind. We did not care about designer labels, fancy dinners, or country club memberships. We cared about building a solid foundation for our future. For 10 agonizingly long years, we worked 80-hour weeks. We skipped vacations, we drove beat-up used cars, we ate cheap groceries, and we saved every single penny we could scrape together. Our ultimate goal was our sanctuary. We found it on the edge of town, a sprawling, 5-bedroom estate sitting on 3 acres of lush land, valued at $1.8 million. When we finally paid off the mortgage in full, we sat on the bare hardwood floor of the empty living room, eating cheap takeout pizza straight from the cardboard box, and we cried. It was ours. Fully, legally, and undeniably ours. No banks, no landlords. Just us. But the universe has a cruel sense of humor. For years ago, Beckett was diagnosed with an aggressive, unforgiving illness. The strong man who could lift engine blocks and build houses from the ground up faded away in a matter of months. It was a nightmare that stripped my world of all its color. Before he passed, he held my hand in the sterile hospital room. His grip was weak, his skin pale, but his eyes were fierce and lucid. He knew my family. He had watched them belittle me for years. He knew exactly how they viewed my wealth and my kind, forgiving nature. "Maeve," he whispered, his voice raspy and barely audible over the hum of the medical machines. "Listen to me. Do not let them in." I squeezed his hand, tears streaming down my face. "What do you mean?" "When I am gone, they will smell the blood in the water," he said, forcing the words out. "They will see a widow in a big house. Do not give them a key. Do not give them an inch. They will take your fortress. Promise me you will protect what we built." I promised him. I swore on my life that I would protect our home. I buried my husband on a rainy Tuesday, threw myself entirely into my work to numb the grief, and lived a quiet, solitary life. The house was undeniably too big for one person, but every corner held a memory of Beckett. His old leather work boots still sat by the back door, exactly where he left them. His favorite armchair remained untouched in his study. I found a strange, comforting peace in the stillness of the large house. Until the stillness was shattered. Invasion never happens all at once. It always starts small. A tiny crack in the foundation that you ignore because it is family. You tell yourself they mean well. You tell yourself you are just being overly sensitive, that you are just grieving. But looking back now, with absolute clarity, I realized that the museum of my pain was built brick by brick over decades, and I was the one who foolishly unlocked the front door and let the thieves inside. What made me break the promise I made to the man I loved? It happened exactly 8 months ago. My phone rang late on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting in Beckett's study, going over inventory reports for the warehouse. I looked at the caller ID and saw it was my mother. The moment I swiped to answer, she burst into frantic, hysterical tears. She claimed a catastrophic plumbing failure had destroyed their luxury downtown apartment. The pipes burst inside the walls, Maeve. She sobbed loudly into the receiver, making sure I could hear the sheer panic in her voice. Everything is ruined. The carpets are soaked, the drywall is crumbling. The management company says it will take at least 6 months to repair the water damage. We have nowhere to go. My father took the phone from her, his voice heavy with fake humility and exhaustion. "We hate to impose on you, sweetheart. We really do. We know you like your privacy. Just for a little while. Just until they fix the floors and we can move back in. The hotels are far too expensive for a long stay. We just need a roof over our heads." My chest tightened. I immediately remembered Beckett's warning in the hospital room. Do not let them in. But these were my parents. They were in their late 60s, claiming they were about to be out on the street with nowhere to sleep. The guilt gnawed at my conscience. Against my better judgment, against the loud voice in the back of my head screaming at me to say no, I caved. I told them they could stay in the 2 guest bedrooms on the 2nd floor. That was the worst mistake of my life. It was a Trojan horse, and I rolled it right through my own front door. The first few weeks were deceptively polite. They moved in with a massive mountain of designer luggage, filling the upstairs hallway. I gave them plenty of space, staying out of their way and retreating to my master suite on the ground floor immediately after returning from work. But soon, the polite facade faded and the microaggressions began. It started with small, seemingly innocent adjustments to my home. One evening, I came home exhausted from the warehouse and walked into the kitchen to make tea. My favorite coffee mugs, the ones Beckett and I had collected from our road trips across the Midwest, were missing from the glass display cabinet. In their place were stark white, minimalist porcelain cups. When I found my mother in the living room and asked where my mugs were, she waved her hand dismissively without looking up from her magazine. "Oh, I boxed those old things up and put them in the garage," she said casually. "They were terribly mismatched, Maeve. It made the kitchen look cluttered and cheap. You need a cleaner aesthetic if you ever want to entertain guests." I marched out to the garage, tore open the cardboard box, retrieved my mugs, and put them back in the cabinet. I told her, in no uncertain terms, never to touch my belongings again. She rolled her eyes and muttered to my father about how I was overly attached to junk. A week later, I noticed Gideon had taken over the garage. He moved my reliable SUV out onto the driveway, exposing it to the elements, just to make room for his least luxury sedan. When I confronted him in the hallway, he gave me a condescending, fatherly smile. "Your car is built for the weather, Maeve," he said, patting my shoulder. "Mine has a highly sensitive custom paint job. It cannot sit in the rain. It is just common sense. We have to protect our investments." I forced him to hand over his keys and moved his car back out to the driveway. The tension in the house thickened rapidly. They were constantly testing the fences, pushing the boundaries to see exactly how much disrespect I would tolerate. But the true turning point, the terrifying moment the cold reality of their invasion set in, happened on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I was looking for a spare pen in the kitchen drawer, digging under some takeout menus, when I found a folded piece of thick, high-quality paper. I pulled it out and unfolded it on the counter. It was a professional architectural blueprint. My heart stopped in my chest as I read the title block printed neatly in the bottom right corner. Master Bedroom Renovation Plan. Client, Mrs. Greta. I stared at the black lines on the paper, my blood running cold. They had hired a draftsman to draft plans to knock down the load-bearing wall of my bedroom, expand the ensuite bathroom, and rip out the custom oak closets that Beckett had built with his own hands. My mother was secretly planning to remodel my bedroom. Not the guest rooms upstairs where they were supposedly staying temporarily. My room. My sanctuary. My hands shook with a mixture of rage and disbelief as I folded the paper back up. They were not waiting for plumbing repairs at their apartment. There was no water damage. They were measuring my home for their new curtains. How deep does this lie go? I wondered, staring at the closed door of the guest room. The devastating answer arrived the very next morning, and it brought my golden sister right along with it. With the discovery of the blueprints, the atmosphere in the house shifted from annoying to openly hostile. And then, Sloane began showing up. At first, she would just drop by unannounced for lunch, complaining about her cramped apartment. Then, she started treating my house like her personal country club. I would come home mentally and physically exhausted from managing supply chain logistics, dealing with delayed shipments and screaming contractors, only to find Sloane and 3 of her equally unemployed, entitled friends lounging by my backyard pool. They would drink my expensive wine, play loud music, and leave wet towels draped over the expensive patio furniture. Whenever I walked past them in my work clothes, Sloane would offer a sweet, venomous smile to her friends. "Oh, ignore Maeve," she would tell them loudly, making sure I heard every word. "She is just grumpy from playing in the dirt with her little metal pipes all day. She does not know how to relax." The breaking point with Sloane did not happen by the pool. It happened in the hallway closet. I was getting ready for work early one morning, rushing to find my keys, when I saw her standing in front of the hallway mirror. She was wearing a heavy, worn canvas jacket. It was Beckett's old work coat. The one I kept precisely because it still smelled faintly of sawdust, motor oil, and his cologne. She was posing in the mirror, twisting side to side, checking her reflection. "Take that off," I demanded, my voice dropping an octave, sounding low and dangerous. Sloane sighed dramatically, looking at me through the mirror, and crossed her arms. "Calm down, Maeve, it is just an old jacket. Vintage oversized workwear is trending right now. I thought I could style it for a social media post today. Take it off right now. You do not touch his things." I stepped closer, my fists clenching at my sides. She rolled her eyes, unzipped the jacket, and let it drop carelessly onto the floor. "You are ridiculous, Maeve," she spat, turning to face me. "You are holding on to dead energy. It has been 4 years since he died. You are turning this beautiful, expensive house into a depressing tomb. You need to let go and let people who actually want to live enjoy this space. You are wasting it. People who actually want to live." She meant herself. She meant my parents. They viewed my grief not as a tragedy, but as an inconvenience, an obstacle blocking their righteous path to my real estate. I picked up the jacket, brushed it off carefully, and hung it back up. I did not say another word to her. I knew arguing with a narcissist was like screaming into a void. But the final piece of the puzzle, the absolute, undeniable truth of their entire operation, fell into my lap by pure accident just 3 days later. I was sorting through the mail that had piled up on the entryway table. There was a thick, official-looking envelope addressed to Gideon, marked urgent from a major national bank. Usually, I respected their privacy and left their mail on the kitchen island. But this envelope had a massive tear down the side, and as I picked it up to move it, a thick document slid out and landed on the floor. The bold red letters printed at the top of the first page caught my eye immediately. Notice of foreclosure and asset seizure. I froze. I looked around to make sure I was alone. I pulled the document out entirely and read it, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. My parents did not have broken pipes. They had not experienced a catastrophic plumbing disaster. Their luxury downtown apartment had been seized by the bank. They were drowning in exactly $350,000 of debt. The high-limit credit cards, the leased luxury cars, the lavish dinners out, the money they threw at Sloan to fund her lifestyle, it was all a fragile house of cards that had finally, spectacularly collapsed. They were completely, legally bankrupt. They were virtually homeless. They had lied to my face. They had concocted a sob story, playing on my guilt and my duty as a daughter, knowing they had absolutely nowhere else to go. And worse, they were planning to stay forever. The blueprints for the master bedroom. The redecorating of the kitchen. The constant, looming presence of my sister claiming the house was being wasted. It was all a highly coordinated siege. They looked at my $1.8 million paid-off estate not as a safe haven, but as their personal financial lifeboat. They planned to throw me overboard to keep themselves afloat. A cold, hard clarity washed over me. The sadness and the guilt evaporated, replaced by a terrifying calm. I did not march upstairs and confront them right then. Confrontation would give them a chance to cry, to manipulate, to twist the narrative and play the victims. I carefully folded the foreclosure notice, slid it back into the torn envelope, and placed it on the kitchen island exactly where it belonged. They thought I was just the dull, hard-working, invisible sister who would quietly absorb their abuse and eventually surrender to keep the peace. They forgot that I run a massive logistics company. I know how to organize a complex supply chain, and more importantly, I know exactly how to ruthlessly dismantle one. How far are they willing to push their luck before the trap snaps shut? I waited in the shadows for their next move, and I did not have to wait long. The ambush was orchestrated perfectly, designed to corner me when I was most vulnerable. It was a Friday evening. I had just walked through the front door after a grueling 12-hour shift at the warehouse. I was tired, hungry, and just wanted a hot shower. But as I walked into the living room, I found Gideon, Greta, and Sloan sitting on the plush sofas, arranged like a tribunal waiting for a criminal. The television was off. The atmosphere was thick with rehearsed solemnity. "Sit down, Maeve," my father said, patting the leather armchair across from him. "We need to have a serious family meeting." I did not sit down. I remained standing, leaning casually against the doorframe, keeping my distance. "I am fine standing right here. What is this about?" My mother clasped her hands together in her lap, her eyes shining with practiced, theatrical tears. "It is wonderful news, really. We are so blessed. Sloan is pregnant." I looked at Sloan. She was sitting with perfect posture, placing a hand flat over her perfectly flat stomach, and offered a demure, innocent nod. I felt absolutely nothing. Knowing Sloane's history of manipulation, There was a remarkably high probability this pregnancy was a complete lie, manufactured at the perfect moment to force my hand. Even if it were true, a baby was just a convenient pawn in their twisted real estate game. "Congratulations," I said flatly, my face a mask of indifference. My father cleared his throat, taking charge of the negotiation. Because of this unexpected blessing, Sloane and her husband are going to need a proper, safe home to raise the child. Their current apartment is far too small, and the neighborhood is simply not suitable for a growing family. I stared at him, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "And?" Greta leaned forward, dropping the act. "We have decided it makes the most sense for Sloane to move in here. With us. We are a family, Maeve, and families help each other in times of need. The 2 upstairs guest rooms will be perfect. One for the nursery, and one for her husband's home office." "And where exactly will you and Dad sleep?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm, knowing exactly what was coming next. My mother did not even flinch. She looked at me as if she were explaining basic math to a toddler. "Well, obviously, we will take the downstairs master bedroom. You are just one person, Maeve. You are a widow. You do not need that massive suite with the soaking tub and the double walk-in closets. You can easily move down into the finished basement. It has a bathroom. It is very cozy. It makes sense for everyone. You need to think about the baby." I looked at the 3 of them. They were sitting in my living room, drinking electricity I paid for, breathing air in a house I owned, and calmly telling me they were relegating me to the underground basement of my own home so they could take over the primary living spaces. They were evicting me from my own life. "No," I said. The single syllable dropped into the room like a heavy stone. My father's fake, diplomatic smile vanished instantly. "Excuse me?" I said no. I stood up straight. "Nobody is moving in. Nobody is taking my bedroom. And nobody is putting me in the basement like a discarded piece of furniture. This is my house, not yours." Sloane jumped up from the sofa, her face twisting in ugly, unmasked entitlement. "You are so unbelievably selfish. You have this giant house all to yourself while I am trying to start a family. What is wrong with you? Why do you have to be such a miserable, greedy bitch? You do not even use half these rooms." I looked straight through her. "Buy your own house, Sloane. If you cannot afford a baby, do not have one." I turned around and walked down the hall to my bedroom, locking the heavy oak door behind me. The retaliation started minutes later. My father pounded on the door, shouting about respect. My mother wailed in the hallway about how I was destroying the family. I ignored it all. I put in my earplugs and went to sleep. By the next morning, the flying monkeys had been officially dispatched. My phone rang nonstop. First it was Aunt Della, my mother's sister, who loved to play the moral authority. "Maeve, how can you do this to your own sister?" She scolded through the phone, her voice dripping with disappointment. "You have a successful company. You have plenty of money in the bank. Your parents are older, they need comfort. Your sister is vulnerable right now. You need to be the bigger person. Sacrifice is what families do. You cannot take your wealth to the grave." Then came Uncle Pierce. "I am very disappointed in you, Maeve. Your father's blood pressure is through the roof because of you. You are tearing this family apart over a few square feet of space. Just let them have the room. Do not be a monster." They were spinning a brilliant, twisted narrative where I was the villainous, greedy millionaire hoarding wealth while my poor, innocent family suffered in poverty. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the framed photo of Beckett on my nightstand. His strong shoulders, his warm, reassuring smile. He had built the stone fireplace in the living room with his own 2 hands. He had installed the hardwood floors late at night when his back ached. He bled for this house. "I am not giving them an inch, Beckett," I whispered to the empty room. The lingering sadness vanished. The hesitation burned away completely. What replaced it was a cold, calculating anger. My parents had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed my quiet, agreeable nature meant I was weak. They were about to learn that quiet people are the ones who know how to plan in the dark. How far are they willing to push their luck before they realize they are standing on a landmine? The answer came in the mail 2 days later, in the form of a thick, glossy party invitation. Greta and Gideon decided the best way to force my compliance was to create a massive public spectacle. They planned a huge family gathering, cleverly disguised as a surprise anniversary party for Aunt Della and Uncle Pierce, to be held at my house on a Saturday night. The guest list was massive, over 50 people. Extended family from out of state, nosy neighbors, and all their country club friends. Their strategy was transparent and vicious. Corner me in front of everyone, use the immense pressure of the crowd, paint me as the villain, and force me to publicly agree to hand over the house to save face. The audacity was breathtaking. But what truly sealed their fate, what guaranteed their absolute destruction, was a digital invoice that arrived in my email inbox from a high-end local catering company. The bill was for $4,500. The client name listed at the top was Mrs. Greta. The email attached to the billing account, however, was mine. My mother had ordered a lavish spread of prime rib, shrimp cocktails, artisan cheeses, and cases of vintage champagne, and she simply put my name on the tab. She assumed I would quietly pay the invoice to avoid a humiliating scene with the vendors on the day of the party. I did not scream. I did not march upstairs and confront her. I simply sat at my desk, picked up my phone, and began making calls. For the past 8 months, I had been secretly keeping my parents afloat. I paid $1,200 a month for their premium health and auto insurance. I paid $800 a month for the household utility bills they racked up by running the central air conditioning with the windows wide open. I had even quietly paid the minimum balances on 2 of their remaining credit cards to stop the aggressive collection agencies from calling my house phone. I called the insurance company first. I canceled their policies, effective immediately. I called the utility companies and requested a total transfer of the billing account back into my father's name. I called the credit card companies and permanently removed my bank account from their autopay systems. I severed every single financial artery I had connected to them. I cut the life support, and I did it all in absolute silence. Then I got into my truck and drove to a massive industrial supply store on the edge of town. I walked down the wide aisles, bypassing the regular household goods, and loaded my heavy-duty metal cart with 50 ultra-thick, tear-resistant, industrial black trash bags. The kind used by demolition crews for heavy construction debris. Next, I sat in the parking lot and called Blair. She had known me since our freshman year of college. She knew Beckett. She knew my history, and she hated my parents with a fiery passion that rivaled my own. When I explained the situation, the blueprints, and the plan for Saturday night, she did not hesitate for a second. "I will be there at 5 o'clock sharp," she said, her voice sharp with anticipation and dark glee. "I will wear flat shoes. Tell me exactly what needs to be packed." Finally, I called Orson. Orson was a seasoned, ruthless estate lawyer, a man who managed my company's contracts and my personal assets. He was pragmatic, terrifyingly smart, and highly respected in our community. I told him what was happening, about the foreclosure notice I had found, and what my family was planning for Saturday night. "I want you at the party, Orson," I told him, gripping the steering wheel. "Bring the legal files. Bring the proof. Consider it done, Maeve," he replied smoothly. "I will wear my best suit." The days leading up to the party were surreal. My parents walked around the house with smug, victorious expressions. Sloane came over every day to direct the florists who were setting up elaborate floral arches in my hallway. They acted like they had already won the war. They treated me like a ghost haunting my own home, talking over me, ignoring me, actively measuring the living room walls for the new paint colors they planned to use once they forced me into the basement. I watched them with a terrifying sense of calm detachment. Every time my mother sneered at my work boots, every time my father parked his leased car in my spot, every time Sloane complained about the lighting in my kitchen, I simply nodded, smiled politely, and walked away. They thought my silence was the silence of submission. They had no idea it was the silence of a countdown timer. I had built an entire distribution empire by knowing exactly where every piece of inventory belonged and how to move it efficiently. On Saturday night, I was going to move them. The caterers arrived at noon. The jazz music started playing at 5. The trap was perfectly set. All I had to do was let them spring it. Are they truly ready to face the devastating consequences of their own greed? If you have enjoyed hearing how this storm was brewing and want to see these entitled people get exactly what they deserve, hit the subscribe button and like this video so you do not miss out on the explosive conclusion. The real chaos is just about to start. Saturday evening arrived with a crisp, biting autumn breeze and a sky painted in deep, bruised shades of twilight. By 6 o'clock, my once peaceful, quiet home had been fully transformed into a chaotic, glittering theater for my parents' grand delusion. Cars lined the long, winding asphalt driveway, spilling out onto the quiet suburban street and blocking the neighbors' mailboxes. The heavy double front doors were propped wide open, welcoming a steady, loud stream of relatives, curious neighbors, and my parents' pretentious acquaintances from their old country club days. Inside, the living room looked like a centerfold spread from a luxury lifestyle magazine. The local florists had spent 6 grueling hours assembling massive, overbearing arches of white roses, hydrangeas, and lilies in the entryway. A string quartet was situated in the far corner of the formal dining room, playing classical music that barely masked the loud, echoing chatter of over 50 guests. Waiters dressed in crisp white button-down shirts and sharp black vests navigated smoothly through the dense crowd, carrying polished silver trays loaded with seared scallops, stuffed mushrooms, and flutes of expensive vintage champagne. The smell of the catered food, a rich blend of roasted prime rib, garlic butter, and fresh baking bread, mingled heavily with the overwhelming scent of the floral arrangements. My mother, Greta, was truly in her element. She wore a flowing, emerald green silk designer dress that she had undoubtedly purchased on a credit card she could not afford to pay off. She floated seamlessly from group to group, a crystal glass of champagne permanently fixed in her manicured hand. She laughed loudly, throwing her head back, and constantly gestured toward the high-vaulted ceilings of my home as if she had laid the bricks herself. I stood near the granite kitchen island, nursing a glass of sparkling water with a lime wedge, simply watching her act out her fantasy. I could hear her telling Aunt Della about how much effort she put into maintaining the property and how she was planning to redesign the backyard landscaping next spring to add a koi pond. She was playing the role of the generous, wealthy matriarch flawlessly. She looked so happy, so deeply convinced of her own lies. Gideon was holding court near the massive stone fireplace, wearing a tailored navy blue suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly. He was regaling a group of my quiet neighbors with heavily exaggerated stories about his supposedly thriving investment portfolio. He sipped his scotch, looking incredibly pleased with himself, acting like the lord of the manor, graciously hosting the local villagers. And then there was Sloane. She wore a tight, sparkling silver cocktail dress that left nothing to the imagination, clinging tightly to her new husband's arm. She was loudly accepting premature congratulations on her supposed pregnancy, soaking up the attention like a sponge, placing a protective hand over a stomach that was flatter than a board. None of them noticed Blair slip through the front door. Blair wore dark denim jeans, a simple black long-sleeve sweater, and flat, rubber-soled shoes, exactly as she had promised when we formulated this plan. She blended in with the catering staff for a brief moment, catching my eye from across the crowded room. I gave her a single, barely perceptible nod. While my mother was busy boasting to the string quartet about her refined musical tastes, and my father was distracted by his own inflated ego, Blair quietly bypassed the main party. She slipped up the wooden staircase, her footsteps entirely silent, and disappeared into the shadows of the second floor. Upstairs, the 2 guest rooms were packed to the brim with my parents' and sisters' belongings. They had practically moved their entire lives into those rooms over the past 8 months, filling the closets with their extravagant wardrobes. Blair had 50 heavy-duty industrial trash bags waiting for her in the hallway linen closet. Her mission was simple but tedious: pack every single item that did not belong to me into those thick black bags. Every designer shoe, every silk blouse, every bottle of expensive perfume, every framed photograph, every tie my father owned. Nothing was to be spared. While Blair worked in the shadows above, the very first crack in my parents' flawless, glittering facade appeared right in front of me in the bright kitchen. The manager of the catering company, a stern-looking woman in a tailored black blazer with her hair pulled into a tight bun, approached Greta near the kitchen island. She carried a digital tablet and looked notably unamused by the loud festivities around her. "Excuse me, Mrs. Greta," the manager said, keeping her voice low but firm enough to cut through the chatter. "We have encountered a slight issue with the final payment for tonight's services." My mother waved her hand dismissively, her diamond rings flashing under the pendant lights, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Just run the card on file, dear. I am entertaining my guests right now. I do not have time for administrative details." "We attempted to process the payment for $4,500, the manager replied, her tone turning icy and professional. "The transaction was declined." Greta's fake, brilliant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The healthy pink color drained rapidly from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old, but she quickly recovered. She let out a sharp, forced, melodic laugh. "Oh, how embarrassing!" she exclaimed, loud enough for a few nearby guests to hear. "It must be a fraud alert. You know how these banks are when you make large, unexpected purchases for parties. It is for my own protection, really." She turned to me, her eyes wide with a silent, frantic demand. "Maeve, darling, since they are having trouble with my account, why do you not just put this on your card for now? I will write you a check first thing on Monday morning, I promise." She expected me to fold. She expected me to pull out my leather wallet, hand over my corporate card, and quietly swallow a $4,500 bill just to avoid making a humiliating scene in front of the catering staff and our relatives. 8 months ago, I might have done exactly that just to keep the fragile peace in the family. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. "No," I said softly. Greta blinked rapidly, clearly thrown off guard by the blunt refusal. "What do you mean, no? Just hand her your card, Maeve. We have over 50 hungry people out there. This is not the time to be stubborn." I looked at the catering manager, offering a polite nod. "The account is not in my name. I did not order this food, nor did I approve this menu. I suggest you ask the actual client for a different form of payment." My mother's face flushed a deep, blotchy red that clashed violently with her emerald dress. She stepped closer to me, invading my personal space, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. "Maeve, do not do this right now. Give her the card. Do not ruin this night for us. Pay for your own party, mother," I whispered back, matching her intensity. "Or they can pack up the prime rib, load it back into their vans, and leave your guests to eat the floral arrangements." Genuine panic flashed in Greta's eyes. She knew I was entirely serious. With trembling hands, she dug deeply into her designer clutch and pulled out a battered, secondary credit card. She handed it to the manager, refusing to make eye contact. "Try this one," she muttered under her breath. The manager tapped the screen, ran the chipped card, and waited in agonizing silence. A few seconds later, the little green checkmark appeared. The payment went through, but I knew exactly what that meant. That specific card had a crippling interest rate, and she had just maxed it out entirely to feed people she only wanted to impress. The financial noose was tightening around her neck, and she had tied the knot herself. Greta glared at me, her eyes filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are going to pay for that little stunt," she hissed softly. I offered her a cold, empty smile. "Enjoy your party." I checked my watch. It was nearing 8 o'clock. Upstairs, I knew Blair was finishing up. The bags were full. The stage was set. It was time for the main event. By 8:15, the noise level in the sprawling living room had reached its absolute peak. The wine was flowing freely, the lavish food had been happily consumed, and the crowd was loose, warm, and cheerful. That was exactly when Gideon decided it was the perfect time to spring the trap they had so carefully laid out for me. He walked purposefully over to the grand stone fireplace, picked up a silver dessert spoon from a nearby tray, and gently tapped it against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut through the heavy chatter. The string quartet immediately stopped playing, resting their bows. 50 pairs of expectant eyes turned toward my father, waiting for his grand speech. "Friends, family, loved ones," Gideon began, his voice projecting across the large room with practiced, theatrical ease. "Thank you all for being here tonight. We gathered to celebrate family, to celebrate Aunt Della and Uncle Pierce, but tonight is about much more than just an anniversary. Tonight is about the beautiful future of our family tree." A murmur of eager anticipation rippled through the gathered crowd. My mother moved gracefully to stand right beside him, beaming with overwhelming pride, holding his arm. Sloane stepped forward as well, holding her husband's hand tightly, looking like the perfect picture of innocent, glowing joy. "As many of you know," Gideon continued, placing a hand over his heart in a gesture of profound emotion, "our beautiful youngest daughter, Sloane, is expecting her first child. We are going to be grandparents again." Wild applause erupted in the room. Aunt Della cheered loudly from the back. Sloane blushed deeply, waving a manicured hand and mouthing the words, "Thank you," to the crowd. "But starting a new family requires a solid, safe foundation," my father said, his tone shifting, turning serious and deeply sentimental. "A child needs space to grow. And that is why we are so profoundly blessed to have a daughter like Maeve." He gestured expansively toward me. The entire crowd physically turned to look at me, smiling warmly, their eyes shining with affection. "Maeve has always been a pillar of quiet strength for this family," he lied smoothly, without a single stutter. "And tonight, she has made an incredibly generous, selfless decision. In the spirit of true family unity, Maeve has decided to gift this beautiful estate to Sloane and her new husband, so they can raise their child in a proper home. Maeve will be downsizing her life, knowing that her legacy and her late husband's hard work will live on through her sister's growing family." The room erupted into thunderous applause once again. People were looking at me with deep admiration. They were clapping for my monumental sacrifice. They thought I was a saint, a grieving widow giving up her castle for new life. They had no idea I was being ambushed, backed into a corner in front of everyone I knew. The clapping slowly died down, and an expectant, heavy silence fell over the room. They were waiting for me to speak. They were waiting for me to walk to the center of the room, hug my sister, cry a few tears, and symbolically hand over the keys. I placed my glass of water down on the kitchen counter. The dull clink of the glass against the granite was the only sound in the room. I looked my father dead in the eye, my expression entirely blank, my posture rigid. "I never agreed to any of that," I said. My voice was not particularly loud, but in that silent room, it carried across the space like a gunshot. The warm smiles froze instantly. The lingering applause died. A heavy, suffocating, awkward silence swallowed the room whole. My father's jaw tightened visibly. He let out a nervous, booming chuckle, desperately trying to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Now, Maeve, sweetheart, do not be modest in front of our guests. We talked about this extensively." "We did not," I replied firmly, taking a slow step forward so everyone could hear me clearly. "I am not giving my house to Sloane. I am not downsizing into the basement. And you are standing there lying to all these people." Sloane abruptly dropped her husband's hand. Her sweet, glowing maternal demeanor vanished in a flash, replaced by the ugly, entitled rage I knew so intimately. "What is your problem?" she shrieked, taking an aggressive step toward me, her face twisting in anger. "Why do you have to humiliate us like this? You are a selfish, bitter widow hoarding a life you do not even deserve." That was the exact moment my mother snapped. Greta marched across the hardwood floor, her face a mask of unfiltered, feral fury. "You are dead to me," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. Without a single second of hesitation, she pulled her arm back and hurled the entire contents of her red wine glass directly into my face. The collective, horrified gasp from the crowd sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. The dark wine splashed violently against my cheeks, stinging my eyes, dripping from my chin, and staining my expensive pale sweater. I stood perfectly still. I did not raise my hands to wipe my face. I did not yell. I did not flinch. I simply turned around, walked steadily through the sliding glass doors, and stepped out onto the dark patio. I pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the glowing screen. I opened the message thread to Blair and typed the 2 words that would end it all. Start now. I stood in the cool, biting night air and counted. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Then, the scream shattered the quiet night. It was Sloane. Inside the house, confused guests were looking up toward the vaulted ceiling of the living room, desperately trying to find the source of the terrified noise. Above them, the indoor balcony that connected the upstairs hallway to the main living area was no longer empty. Blair stood firmly at the wooden railing. Without uttering a single word, she hoisted a massive, bulging black industrial trash bag over the banister. She let go. The heavy bag plummeted 20 feet and crashed directly onto the center of the crystal catering table with a deafening, explosive crash. The violent impact shattered the thick glass table into thousands of sharp pieces. Silver trays of expensive food went flying through the air. The thick trash bag split open upon impact, violently ejecting its contents everywhere. Sloane's expensive designer high heels, a vast collection of silk blouses, and an entire rack of her pricey makeup palettes scattered across the hardwood floor, sliding through the roasted prime rib, mashed potatoes, and shattered crystal. Before anyone could even begin to comprehend what had just happened, a second bag dropped from the sky. This one landed squarely on the plush white living room sofa with a heavy, sickening thud, bursting open to reveal Gideon's tailored dry-cleaned suits and Greta's expensive imported skincare products. What is happening? Aunt Della screamed at the top of her lungs, grabbing her husband's arm and pulling him back. Then came the third bag. Then the fourth. Then the fifth. It was a torrential, relentless downpour of garbage bags. Blair was working with terrifying, mechanical efficiency, dragging bag after bag from the hallway and hurling them over the balcony. Boom. 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 The elegant living room turned into an active war zone. Guests shrieked in terror and scrambled backward, pressing themselves flat against the walls to avoid being hit by the heavy falling debris. A heavy bag containing Gideon's prized golf clubs hit the stone fireplace with a loud, violent metallic clatter, snapping one of the expensive drivers clean in half. Another bag exploded near the string quartet, sending the panicked musicians running frantically for the front door, abandoning their sheet music. My parents' entire fake, luxurious, carefully constructed life was literally falling from the sky, wrapped in cheap black plastic garbage bags, smashing into pieces in front of 50 witnesses. The extravagant anniversary party had been entirely annihilated in less than 60 seconds. The rain of black bags finally stopped. The sprawling living room looked like the devastating aftermath of a bizarre, localized tornado. Massive piles of wrinkled clothes, scattered shoes, broken toiletries, and smashed electronics were strewn wildly across the hardwood floor, heavily mixed with shattered glass, spilled red wine, and crushed appetizers. The guests stood pressed against the walls in stunned, horrified silence, staring blankly at the unbelievable wreckage before them. I slowly opened the sliding glass door and walked back inside the house. The dark red wine was still drying on my face, making my skin feel tight and sticky, but my posture was ramrod straight, and my eyes were utterly merciless. Upstairs, Blair leaned over the wooden railing, calmly dusting off her hands. She looked down at the chaotic scene below with profound, visible satisfaction. "Your little party is over," Blair announced, her voice echoing clearly and sharply through the ruined, silent room. "Gather your trash and get out of my friend's house." Sloane was on her knees in the dead center of the room, crying hysterically as she frantically tried to scoop up her broken eyeshadow palettes and wine-stained silk dresses. "My things," she wailed, her hands covered in smashed foundation and sticky food. "Look what you did to my things. You ruined everything." Greta was trembling violently from head to toe, her face pale with a mixture of profound shock and feral rage. She pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at me. "You are insane," she screamed, her voice cracking. "I am calling the police right now. You cannot do this to us. We live here. We have legal rights." "Actually, Greta, you do not." The calm, deep, authoritative voice came from the back of the room. The crowd of relatives slowly parted as Orson, my estate lawyer, stepped forward into the light. He was wearing a sharp, immaculate charcoal suit, carrying a thick, heavy leather briefcase. He looked entirely out of place amidst the garbage and chaos, which made his presence even more intimidating and official. Orson walked to the center of the room, carefully stepping over the scattered clothes at his feet. He unlatched his briefcase with a sharp click and pulled out a thick stack of legally certified, stamped documents. "My name is Orson Vance," he said loudly, addressing the entire room, his voice carrying the weight of a judge. "I am the legal counsel managing this estate. My client, Maeve, is the sole legal owner of this property. Gideon and Greta are not tenants. They pay zero rent. They have no lease agreement. They are legally classified as temporary guests, and their invitation to remain on these premises has just been permanently revoked." Uncle Pierce puffed up his chest, his face red with indignation, and stepped forward, trying desperately to defend his older brother. "Now listen here, pal. You cannot just throw family out onto the street in the middle of the night like a bunch of stray dogs. Gideon owns a luxury apartment downtown. They are just staying here while the pipes are fixed. This is a temporary misunderstanding." Orson offered a tight, pitying smile. He held up a document with a bold, glaring red header. "That is factually incorrect, sir," Orson stated clearly, projecting his voice so even the people in the hallway could hear. "Gideon and Greta do not own an apartment. As of 3 weeks ago, their primary residence was officially seized by the bank due to severe financial delinquency. They are currently facing active foreclosure and are drowning in exactly $350,000 of unsecured debt. They lied to my client to gain entry into this home because they are, for all intents and purposes, entirely bankrupt and facing homelessness." The collective gasp from the flying monkeys was the sweetest, most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Aunt Della's jaw dropped open. She looked at Greta, her eyes wide, waiting for a fiery denial, waiting for her sister to call the lawyer a liar and defend their honor. But Greta said nothing. She looked down at the floor, her hands shaking, her face burning with immense, undeniable shame. The grand illusion was permanently shattered. The wealthy, successful, condescending matriarch was publicly exposed as a desperate, lying fraud. But wait, someone in the crowd whispered loudly, breaking the silence. "What about Sloane? She needs a house for the new baby." Orson calmly pulled a second sheet of paper from his leather briefcase. He looked down at Sloane, who was still kneeling on the floor, suddenly very quiet, clutching a ruined dress to her chest. "According to the comprehensive background check we ran this morning," Orson continued, his tone clinical, dry, and unyielding, "Sloane has a credit score of 420. She has currently maxed out 7 different credit cards, mostly on luxury retail purchases, and has 0 verifiable income on record. Furthermore, there are no medical records indicating a pregnancy, and her husband is currently unemployed. They were never planning to buy a house. They were planning to move in here and illegally squat on my client's property." The room was so quiet you could hear the distant hum of the refrigerator. The relatives who had spent the last 2 days calling my phone, lecturing me about sacrifice, moral duty, and family loyalty were now staring at my parents and sister with naked, visceral disgust. The country club people my mother had tried so desperately to impress were now looking at her like she was carrying a contagious disease. Gideon looked around the room, his eyes frantic, darting from face to face, realizing that his reputation was ruined forever in this town. He looked at his brother. "Pierce," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "Pierce, you have to understand. Things got a little out of hand with the investments." Uncle Pierce took a slow, deliberate step backward, shaking his head in disgust. "Do not talk to me, Gideon. You lied to us. You tried to steal your own grieving daughter's home. You sicken me." The crowd began to thin out rapidly. The guests did not even bother to say goodbye or offer apologies. They quietly picked up their coats from the front closet, carefully stepped over the massive piles of garbage bags, and hurried out the front door into the cold night, eager to escape the toxic, humiliating fallout of my family's total collapse. The flying monkeys had lost their wings, and the circus was finally over. Within 10 short minutes, the sprawling house was entirely empty of guests. Only my parents, Sloane, her husband, Orson, Blair, and I remained standing in the wreckage. The grand, lavish anniversary party was a distant memory, replaced by the grim, harsh reality of an immediate eviction. I stepped forward, my boots crushing a piece of shattered crystal into the hardwood floor. I looked at the 3 people who had made my life miserable for decades, the people who had viewed my kindness as a weakness to be exploited. "You have exactly 30 minutes, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion, cold and hollow. Greta looked up from the floor, her expensive mascara running down her pale cheeks in thick dark streaks. 30 minutes for what? She croaked. 30 minutes to stuff your garbage into those bags, carry it out to your cars, and get off my property, I replied. When the clock hits 31 minutes, I am dragging whatever is left inside this house out to the curb, and the city garbage trucks will take it in the morning. I am not repeating myself. Sloane's husband, who had been completely, cowardly silent the entire evening, finally found his voice. You cannot be serious, he stammered, looking around wildly. We have nowhere to go tonight. It is dark outside. It is freezing. I stared at him, feeling nothing but contempt. That sounds like a problem a capable husband should be able to solve for his pregnant wife. Your 30 minutes started a minute ago. Better start packing. The stark realization hit them all at once. There would be no negotiating. There would be no tears, no guilt trips, and no fake apologies that could save them now. The walk of shame officially began. It was a pathetic, deeply satisfying sight to behold. My father, still wearing his tailored navy blue suit, dropped to his knees in the middle of the mess and started frantically shoving his expensive golf shirts, leather belts, and slacks into a torn black trash bag. My mother, in her elegant green silk dress, crawled across the sticky floor, weeping openly as she gathered her scattered cosmetics, jewelry, and underwear, tossing them indiscriminately into the plastic. Sloane was sobbing loudly, tossing her broken shoes and ripped dresses into a bag, her perfect hair messy and ruined, screaming at her husband to help her move faster. They were literally surrounded by the wreckage of their own greed. They had tried to steal a castle, and now they were picking up scraps in the ruins like scavengers. Blair came downstairs, her face glowing with triumph, and stood next to me, arms crossed, watching them work. Orson stood near the doorway, checking his gold watch every 5 minutes, calling out the time like a referee at a boxing match. 20 minutes remaining, Orson announced coldly. They moved faster, their panic escalating as the reality of the cold night outside set in. Gideon dragged 3 heavy bags toward the front door, his face bright red, sweating profusely in his expensive suit, his chest heaving. He looked broken. The arrogant king had been reduced to a frantic peasant hauling trash. When there were only 5 minutes left on the clock, Gideon stopped dragging bags. He walked slowly over to me, stopping a few feet away. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling violently. He looked smaller, older, and more fragile than I had ever seen him. Maeve, he whispered, his voice cracking, shedding his pride. Please. You have made your point. You humiliated us in front of everyone we know. We have no money. The bank took everything. We literally have nowhere to sleep tonight. You cannot throw your own mother and father out onto the street in the dark. Please, Maeve. Just let us stay in the basement for a few days until we figure this out. He was begging. My father, the man who had belittled my business, mocked my late husband, favored my sister, and tried to rob me blind, was begging for a spot in my dark basement. I looked at him, searching my heart for any lingering trace of sympathy, any small drop of daughterly guilt. I looked deep inside myself, trying to find the little girl who just wanted her father's approval. I found absolutely nothing. The well was dry. The cheapest motel in town is 3 miles down the highway, near the interstate, I said, keeping my voice steady, cold, and unwavering. It is $45 a night. I suggest you pull whatever cash you have left in your wallets and start driving. Gideon's face crumpled in despair. You are a monster, he wept, covering his face with his hands. No, I replied softly. I am the daughter you created. Now take your trash and get out of my home. Time is up, Orson announced, snapping his leather briefcase shut with a loud finality. Sloane and her husband dragged the last of their heavy bags out the front door, panting and crying. My mother refused to look at me as she walked out, her shoulders slumped in total defeat, clutching a broken makeup mirror. Gideon followed them, carrying a garbage bag full of shoes over his shoulder, looking like a defeated soldier retreating from a lost war. I stood in the doorway and watched them pack their bags into the trunk of Gideon's leased sedan and Sloane's rusted compact car. The process took another 10 minutes. They argued with each other the entire time, their voices echoing in the quiet neighborhood, blaming one another for the failure of their grand scheme. Finally, the trunk slammed shut. The engine started. Without a single look back, the two cars pulled out of my driveway and drove off into the dark night, their taillights fading into the distance. I closed the heavy oak front door and locked the deadbolt. The sharp, metallic click of the lock echoing in the quiet hallway was the most beautiful, comforting sound in the entire world. The house was a catastrophic mess. The living room smelled strongly of spilled red wine, crushed garlic, and roasted meat. The floor was covered in torn plastic, broken glass, and discarded food. But for the very first time in 8 long months, the air inside my home felt breathable. The suffocating, heavy weight of their toxic presence was finally gone. Blair walked into the kitchen, stepping carefully over the debris, and grabbed a bottle of Pinot Noir that had somehow survived the massacre. She popped the cork, poured 2 large glasses, and walked back over, handing one to me. To Beckett, she said, raising her glass, a soft smile on her face. To Beckett, I echoed. I took a long sip. The wine tasted like freedom. It tasted like victory. We spent the next 2 hours cleaning up the worst of the mess, sweeping up the glass and tossing the ruined food into the outdoor bins. Orson took his leave shortly after the cars drove away, promising to send a formal, aggressive cease and desist letter to my parents first thing Monday morning to ensure they never legally set foot on my property again. The dramatic aftermath of that night rippled through my extended family, like a massive shockwave. Over the next few weeks, the updates filtered in through the family grapevine. Aunt Della, who had permanently blocked my mother's phone number the morning after the party, called me frequently to gossip. My parents had spent their first night in the cheap roadside motel. With no credit cards left to max out and 0 savings in the bank, they were forced to surrender Gideon's leased luxury car back to the dealership. They ended up moving into a cramped, depressing 1-bedroom apartment on the bad side of town, relying entirely on their meager Social Security checks to survive. Sloane's fate was even worse. When her new husband finally realized that the golden child was actually a broke, unemployed liability with terrible credit, and that the $1 million house was never going to be theirs, he packed his bags and left her. The pregnancy, as I had suspected all along, was a complete fabrication used to manipulate me. She was currently sleeping on the pull-out couch in our parents' tiny, dingy apartment, miserable, broke, and entirely alone. They tried to call me, of course. Gideon left desperate voicemails begging for a small loan to help with groceries. Greta sent long, rambling text messages demanding I pay for her trauma therapy. Sloane emailed me, blaming me entirely for her divorce and ruined life. I did not listen to the voicemails, I did not read the texts, and I did not respond to the emails. I blocked their numbers, blocked their email addresses, and hired a private security company to upgrade the alarm system and install cameras around my house. I hired a professional cleaning crew to scrub the guest rooms upstairs, erasing every trace of their existence. I threw away the minimalist white porcelain cups my mother had bought and put Beckett's mismatched, beloved coffee mugs proudly back on display in the glass cabinet. I planted new, vibrant roses in the backyard garden, preparing for the spring. I reclaimed my fortress. People often ask me if I feel guilty. They ask how I can sleep soundly at night knowing my own flesh and blood is struggling to pay rent in a run-down apartment while I live alone in a sprawling estate. They tell me that family is family, no matter what they do, and that forgiveness is a virtue. But I learned a very painful, very important lesson through this ordeal. Family is not a blank check for abuse. Blood does not give anyone the right to steal your peace, disrespect your boundaries, or lay claim to the things you bled and sacrificed to build. Respect is a currency, and my family's account with me went bankrupt a long, long time ago. Just last week, Aunt Della called me again. She told me that my mother had fallen ill. Nothing serious, just a bad seasonal flu, but she was crying in her tiny apartment, begging for me to come visit her. She said Greta was asking for my forgiveness and wanted to make amends. I listened to Della's plea, took a sip of hot coffee from Beckett's old mug, and hung up the phone without saying a single word. I went out to the backyard, sat on the wooden patio furniture my husband built with his own hands, and enjoyed the morning sunshine in total, absolute silence. Many of my extended relatives think I am cold-blooded. They whisper behind my back that I am heartless for abandoning my sick mother and struggling sister, despite everything they did to me. So, I turn to you. Did I take it too far? Am I the villain for refusing to grant them a second chance, or was turning my back on them the only way to save myself from being entirely consumed by their greed? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found yourself rooting for me, and if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Your support means everything.